fourth row. Oh, okay. Now we're going to talk about the office that's on the fourth row. When we're talking about rows, we're actually talking about when you go in to vote, there are going to be lines for each office. So we talked about the first 3 lines of candidates are for the judges, and the fourth one is almost kind of like a quarter way down is going to be the mayor.
That's right. If you think about our ballot reads like a book, and you read a book from left to right. So the judgeships are going to be left to right, the first 3 rows, and then the mayor's race is going to be that 4th row, and that's where you're going to see the Democratic candidates for mayor and the Republican candidates for mayor. There's 3 candidates for mayor. There's Mayor Jim Kenney. He's running for a 2nd term in office. There's Pennsylvania State Senator Anthony Hardy Williams, who's running his 2nd time for mayor. He lost to Mayor Kenney 4 years ago. And former City Controller Alan Bukovitz, who is running for his 1st time as mayor. And also the winner of the Democratic primary will face off against William Billy Ciancaglini, a lawyer who is a Republican nominee, but in the city of Philadelphia, as the Democratic primary goes, so goes the election. A good piece of trivia, there has been no candidate that has run for re-election for mayor in Philadelphia since the city charter was put into place in 1952 that has lost re-election. So we've never had a mayor run for a 2nd term that has lost for a 2nd term. Things could be different this year, but it's going to be interesting to see.
Right. So these statistics are with the current mayor.
Correct.
But we have to show up and vote, and people will make their decisions on May 21st.
May 21st. It's like sports. That's why you play the game.
That's right.
You never know what's going to happen.
So let's talk about some of the issues that are being talked about regarding the mayor's office. The top one that seems to be rolling off everybody's tongue is the soda tax.
So it's officially the sweetened beverage tax.
Yes.
Because it has a lot. But Mayor Kenney got passed the sweetened beverage tax probably about a year ago, year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, in order to pay for his pre-K initiative to get more kids in pre-kindergarten, the Rebuild initiative, which will spend hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 5 to 7 years on parks, recreation, and libraries, and also community schools, which are basically kind of school hubs, if you would, that would be places of where everybody goes to, where they have a whole bunch of events and a whole bunch of events. They're mostly high schools, so that's what he's been paying with out of the soda tax. People have not liked the soda tax because it hasn't just dealt with soda. It's dealt with anything that's sweetened beverage. So
right, like
your almond milk, yeah, I know you have an almond milk thing, but almond milk, sports drinks are covered by that. But the mayor says if you don't want to pay the tax, don't buy a sweetened beverage. It's not a forced thing for you to do. As he likes to say, when did there become like a moral imperative that you have to have a soda? And right. That's Mayor Kenney's thought. The other candidates.
Well, so there are some unintended consequences of that tax. I mean, I think people were very surprised that most people are not drinking almond milk for fun, So those are the kind of things that are being impacted. So I don't know if there's any discussion on the table about amending the list of things that fall under the sweetened beverage tax, and whether that's something that's being talked about on the campaign trail, since you do talk to a lot of
You know what? It's not being talked about on the campaign trail, but the great thing about legislation is once there's a hiccup in it or a problem, you can always go back and change that piece of legislation. So I would not be surprised if the next mayor, whomever that person is, in January 2020, might decide to alter it a little bit and say, these things were covered, but this was the unintended consequence, we might switch that. But as of right now, Mayor Kenney has said if he wins a 2nd term, he's not changing the legislation at all. The other candidates, Senator Williams and Alan Bukovitz, have said they're getting rid of the sweetened beverage tax. They're just getting rid of it. They can pay for the programs that Mayor Kenney has implemented, pre-K, Rebuild, and community schools, by just using the surplus that's in the budget. But the problem with the surplus, and this is important for people to know, is surpluses are not supposed to be ever used in most budgets for recurring things.
Right.
You don't use a surplus for a recurring thing because you spend down on a surplus. And the question is going to be, if any candidate for mayor wants to pay for all of these things, rebuild, pre-K, and community schools, you got to be able to pay for it.
Right.
And if we know right now, according to the mayor, that the tax brings about $75 to $80 million, you pay for taxes two ways in Philly, generally. You either keep the tax and spend from that. You either have to cut from departments, $75 to $80 million, or you decide to repeal it. And then if you repeal it, all of the things that you've already implemented kind of stop in the middle. I don't see any of it being stopped in the middle, but the question is going to be, how do you pay for it?
Yeah. So let me ask you a question about how it works when we do transition to a different mayor. Does that means that all the programs that they implemented that aren't part of like the city constitution, which is also known as the charter, they could go away or they could stay. It depends on what the new mayor wants to bring in.
That's absolutely true. I've covered enough mayors where they've named it different things, but they've kept it. Mm-hmm. I didn't like this initiative, but I'm going to name it this initiative. And it's like, well, but you're keeping the same thing. But a lot of mayors get rid of programs or they alter it completely. A lot of programs in city government, because it's part of the budget, stays no matter what. You might have a new mayor, but then a good example, new mayor might come in and might have a different police commissioner, but he or she is not going to suddenly change the role of the police department, right? The bomb squad suddenly is not going to be changed to something else. The recreation department is suddenly not going to be changed to something else. The pools are always going to open on time. But that's the difference with every mayor. Every mayor envisions his or her administration differently and the things that they consider important. So that's another thing as well. I tell people, you have that loss of continuity sometimes when a mayor is done with their 8 years in office. Right. If they win a second term and they're done with their 8 years, then a new mayor has to come in and decide whether they want to keep the programs or not. So I will say this, if a new mayor is elected in Philadelphia and serves on January 2020, the major programs will not go away. Like the ship of state is just too big for that to happen. But there will be things that change because every mayor changes.
And that's important too when you're voting, right, that you ask the candidates if you have particular programs that you want to see continue, right, even with the current mayor, and you make sure that is a question and you ask them at a forum or you look at their platform online to make sure that what you care about is going to be continued in the city or discontinued.
Okay. Every mayor has their own vision.
Right. And let's talk about the other thing that's rarely talked about in a lot of general circles, but about the police contract negotiation.
Yeah.
So that's happening in 2020. Can you shed some light on that?
Absolutely. The Philadelphia Police Department, there's about 6,000 officers in the police department. The rank and file officers, the men and women that you see on the streets every day, they are covered by a contract. Their union is the Fraternal Order of Police. And they come up for a contract.
FOP.
They come up for a contract that's like the firefighters and District Council 33, which represents trash workers, and District Council 47, which are white collar workers who are folks that are in offices. That contract is very critical because of any changes that the city would want in the contract concerning police arbitration, where officers live. Because the last contract, it used to be in Philadelphia that you had to live in the city of Philadelphia in order to work in the city of Philadelphia. But under the last contract, the city agreed to let officers live outside of the city. So a Philadelphia police officer now can live outside of the city. Also, if you want to have issues with, what do you do with a road cop? If a cop has done something bad, how do you get rid of them on the force? That's something that has to be negotiated in a contract. Most of the times, the contract has it where a cop would go through arbitration. And it's up to a 3-person arbitration panel to decide whether an officer stays or goes. A lot of times those arbitration panels keep an officer. Even if they're a really questionable cop that should be off the force, but that can be negotiated in a contract. So that's something that
Right.
the next mayor will have to deal with.
Well, doesn't it work now? Like, even if like the police commissioner fires an officer, they can go through some kind of arbitration and get their job back.
That's exactly how it's been all the time. And a lot of times the arbitrators side with the officers. So you know, even if the commissioner has a reason to fire somebody, they have it ironclad. They know there's a reason. Those folks have to go in front of an arbitrator, and it has not been unusual for a 3-person arbitrator to come back and say that person deserves their job back, and sometimes with back pay.
Okay, so that's something like, even if someone is leaning toward the incumbent, that's an issue that we should pay attention to, because it's not even just that we're voting on May 21st. We're voting for the day after May 21st, and so on. So to hold someone accountable, you actually have to know what they're doing in office. And if you know that police contract is coming up in 2020, you start making your phone calls, sending your letters. This is what I'd like to see in that contract. Talked about this before. You talked about that in the last contract. They made a change where the police officers didn't have to live in the city anymore.
That's true.
Is that something that could be negotiated again?
Absolutely.
Or-
Everything in the contract can be negotiated. Everything.
Everything's negotiable.
Everything's negotiable in a contract. So right now, if you are a police officer, you used to have to live in the city of Philadelphia. It was called the residency rule. You have to be a resident of the city of Philadelphia. A lot of city agencies still have that residency rule where you have to live in the city. I believe the fire department still has it. The sanitation department still has it. And even a lot of people that are, you know, commissioners, police commissioner, fire commissioner, they're kind of told you have to live in the city. But the rank and file officers don't have to under the last contract. So you can now be a Philadelphia police officer but live in the suburbs and still be able to keep your job.
So I have a question about the demographic makeup of the police. So there is, I'm saying it in a nice way, how many officers are white versus all the others?
You know, I don't have that demographic, but there are about 6,600 Philadelphia police employees. Overwhelming majority of them are white.
Right.
And that's historic. So, you know, the one thing about city government that's great is that there's 25,000 total employees in city government. One of the worst things about city government is that people don't leave, right? So you don't get new blood. So if you've been a police officer, you're probably going to be an officer for like 10, 15, 20 years. If you work in the sanitation department, you're probably going to be there 20, 30 years. I mean, there's reports of employees who have worked in city government for like 50 years, 60 years. So that's why that diversity number doesn't change, because if you've been in city government for like an average of 30 years and you started like as a teenager, you're not leaving. So that's another thing that mayors can deal with too, is how do you start the process of diversifying city government so it looks more like the population of the city. So mayors, I always like to tell people, mayors are the CEO of the city.
Right.
They run a $4 billion budget. That's bigger than some companies.
Annually.
That's annually.
Yes,
that's
every
year. That's a $4 billion budget. That's more than some companies administer, and probably more than some small countries in a way. So, you know, the mayor controls a lot of spending in departments. A lot.